Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. Tonight we're diving into one of the most catastrophic yet overlooked events in Earth's recent history. Picture this: massive walls of water, some reaching heights that would dwarf modern skyscrapers, tearing across entire continents. Landscapes carved in days that should have taken millennia to form, and all of this happening while our ancestors watched from whatever high ground they could find. I'm talking about the colossal floods that brought the last ice age to a dramatic and violent end. And before you settle in, if you enjoy these deep dives into Earth's hidden past, a quick like really helps the channel grow. Also, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from tonight and what time it is there. I love seeing how these stories reach people all around the world. Now, most of us learned in school that the ice age ended gradually, with ice sheets slowly melting away as temperatures rose. The textbooks painted a picture of gentle warming, of glaciers retreating at a leisurely pace over thousands of years. But here's the thing, that's not what the evidence actually shows. What really happened was far more dramatic, far more sudden, and absolutely fascinating. The story begins around 20,000 years ago, when nearly 1/3 of all land on Earth lay buried beneath ice sheets. These weren't just thick patches of snow. We're talking about frozen walls that stretched higher than modern mountains, some reaching over a mile in thickness. These massive ice sheets covered most of northern Europe, much of North America, and extended their icy fingers into regions that today enjoy warm climates. But here's where it gets interesting. All that ice represented something extraordinary: water, enormous volumes of it, locked away high above sea level. So much water was trapped in these frozen reservoirs that the oceans themselves had dropped dramatically. Coastlines sat far from where they rest today. Vast plains stretched across what are now underwater continental shelves. You could literally walk from Britain to mainland Europe across dry land. This wasn't just a different climate. This was a fundamentally different planet, with different geography, different ocean levels, and different rules about where land ended and water began. Land bridges connected continents that today feel impossibly separate. Animals and early humans could migrate across distances that now lie deep beneath the waves. For thousands of years, this system held. Ice accumulated season after season, year after year, century after century. The frozen water stayed locked in place, maintaining this radically altered world. But nothing in nature remains static forever, and the forces that had built this icy world were beginning to shift. The first signs of change came not as dramatic melting, but as subtle alterations in Earth's relationship with the sun. Our planet's orbit and tilt undergo slow cycles that affect how solar energy is distributed across the globe. These changes are incredibly gradual, almost imperceptible within a human lifetime, but over thousands of years they can fundamentally alter climate patterns. As these orbital cycles shifted, summers in the northern hemisphere began lasting just a little longer. Sunlight lingered just a bit higher in the sky. The ice sheets, which had seemed so permanent and stable, started to weaken. But they didn't simply begin melting uniformly. Instead, something far more complex and dangerous was taking place. Ice sheets aren't solid blocks. They're dynamic systems, constantly flowing and adjusting under their own immense weight. Deep within these frozen masses, pressure had been building for millennia. The weight of ice above compressed the layers below. Heat from the Earth's interior gradually warmed the base of these ice sheets, creating thin films of liquid water between the ice and the ground beneath. This hidden water was crucial. It acted like a lubricant, allowing entire sections of the ice sheets to slide more easily. As the climate began its subtle shift toward warmth, more meltwater formed at the base and along the edges of these massive ice formations. Cracks appeared, pressure points developed. The ice that had seemed so solid and eternal was actually becoming increasingly unstable. Meanwhile, enormous lakes had formed along the edges of the ice sheets. These weren't ordinary lakes. Some were the size of modern Great Lakes, held back by natural dams made of ice and debris. The water in these lakes came from melting ice, and as temperatures continued their gradual rise, these lakes grew larger and deeper. The ice dams holding back these massive bodies of water weren't permanent structures built of stone. They were temporary barriers made of frozen water, debris, and compressed snow. As the climate warmed, these dams began to weaken. Small leaks appeared. Water found its way into cracks and crevices. And here's where the physics becomes terrifying. Water has a unique property that makes it incredibly destructive once it starts moving in volume. When an ice dam begins to fail, it doesn't fail gradually, like a stone wall slowly crumbling. It fails catastrophically. A small breach becomes a larger one. Water pressure increases exponentially. The dam doesn't just leak, it explodes outward, releasing astronomical amounts of water in an incredibly short time. Scientists have found evidence of these catastrophic releases carved into the landscape itself. In places like the northwestern United States, massive channels cut through solid bedrock tell the story of floods beyond anything in recorded human history. These aren't the gentle valleys carved by rivers over millions of years. These are scars left by moving walls of water that reshaped entire regions in a matter of days or weeks. The scale of these floods is difficult to comprehend. Modern rivers, even during major floods, carry thousands of cubic feet of water per second. The ancient floods that ended the Ice Age carried millions of cubic feet per second. Some estimates suggest flow rates that exceeded the combined discharge of all the world's rivers today, concentrated into single channels. These weren't just larger versions of floods we might recognize. They were fundamentally different phenomena. The water didn't simply overflow riverbanks. It created new geography. Hills were carved away entirely. Valleys were excavated in solid rock. Boulders the size of houses were lifted and carried for miles as if they weighed nothing at all. The evidence for these massive floods appears in multiple forms across the landscape. Giant ripple marks, formed by moving water, stretch across valleys with wavelengths measured in hundreds of feet. These ripples are so large that early geologists couldn't recognize them from ground level. Only when viewed from aircraft did their true scale become apparent. Elsewhere, the bedrock itself tells the story. Massive areas of stone lie stripped clean of soil and sediment, scoured bare by the passage of water moving at incredible speeds. The surface of this rock is polished smooth in some places, deeply grooved in others, marked by parallel scratches that show the direction the flood waters travelled. But perhaps most remarkably, these flood features appear not just in one location, but across multiple continents. Similar scars mark landscapes in North America, Europe, and Asia. The timing of these floods, based on geological dating techniques, aligns with the end of the last ice age. This wasn't a single catastrophic event, but a series of massive releases that occurred as the global ice system collapsed. The story becomes even more complex when we examine what happened to all that water once it was released. It didn't simply flow into the oceans and disappear. The sudden addition of enormous volumes of fresh water had profound effects on ocean circulation, climate patterns, and the stability of the remaining ice sheets. The oceans of 20,000 years ago weren't just lower than today's seas. They were fundamentally different in their circulation patterns. Ocean currents depend on differences in water temperature and salinity to drive their flow. When massive amounts of fresh, cold water suddenly poured into the oceans, these circulation patterns were disrupted in ways that affected the entire planet. This disruption wasn't just a local phenomenon. Ocean currents are global systems that transport heat from the tropics toward the poles and cold water in the opposite direction. When these currents are interrupted, climate patterns worldwide can shift dramatically. Regions that had been warming suddenly cooled. Areas that had received regular precipitation found themselves in drought conditions. The complexity of this system meant that the end of the Ice Age wasn't a smooth transition from cold to warm. Instead, it was a chaotic period of rapid changes, sudden reversals, and dramatic reorganizations of Earth's climate system. The Ice Age didn't simply fade away. It ended in a series of catastrophic events that reshaped not just the landscape, but the entire planetary system. What makes this story even more remarkable is that humans were present to witness these events. Our ancestors lived through the most dramatic climate changes in recent Earth history. They watched as familiar landscapes were transformed beyond recognition. They experienced the sudden appearance of new rivers, the disappearance of land bridges, and the dramatic rise of sea levels. The archaeological record shows clear evidence of human populations adapting to these rapidly changing conditions. Migration patterns shifted, tool technologies changed, social structures evolved in response to environmental pressures that modern humans have never experienced. These ancient floods represent something unprecedented in recorded human history, yet they occurred during a time when our species was already established across multiple continents. The survivors of these events carried forward not just their genes, but their memories, their stories, and their hard-won knowledge of how to survive in a world that could change beyond recognition within a single generation. As we continue this investigation into the great floods that ended the Ice Age, we'll explore the specific mechanisms that triggered these catastrophic releases, examine the geological evidence that allows us to reconstruct these ancient events, and discover how these floods literally created the world we inhabit today. The mechanics behind these catastrophic floods reveal just how delicate the balance was that held the Ice Age world together. To understand what triggered these massive releases, we need to look beneath the surface of those seemingly stable ice sheets and examine the hidden vulnerabilities that had been developing for thousands of years. The process began with something called ice sheet dynamics, a field of study that has revolutionized our understanding of how these massive frozen structures actually behave. Unlike the static image we might have of glaciers as slow-moving or stationary ice, these continental-scale ice sheets were constantly in motion, flowing outward from their centers under the sheer weight of accumulated snow and ice. Picture the Laurentide ice sheet, which covered most of Canada and the northern United States. At its thickest points, this ice sheet reached heights of over 2 miles. The pressure at the base of such a massive structure was extraordinary, literally crushing the landscape beneath and creating conditions that we're only now beginning to fully understand. Under this immense pressure, something remarkable happened at the interface between ice and ground. The pressure was so intense that it actually lowered the melting point of ice, creating thin films of liquid water even in temperatures well below freezing. This water acted as a lubricant, allowing sections of the ice sheet to slide more easily across the underlying bedrock. But the story becomes even more complex when we consider the geography beneath these ice sheets. The land wasn't flat. There were valleys, ridges, and depressions that channeled the flow of ice in specific directions. Some areas became natural collection points for meltwater, creating vast subglacial lakes that grew larger as the climate began its slow shift toward warming. Lake Missoula in what is now Montana provides one of the best documented examples of how these systems worked. This lake formed when the advancing Cordilleran ice sheet blocked the natural drainage of the Clark Fork River, creating a massive dam of ice and debris. As water accumulated behind this natural barrier, Lake Missoula grew to contain more water than Lakes Erie and Ontario combined. The ice dam holding back Lake Missoula wasn't a solid wall. It was a complex structure of ice, rock, and sediment that had formed over centuries. As the regional climate began warming, this dam started experiencing stresses it had never faced before. Warmer temperatures created more surface melting. Increased water pressure pushed against weak points in the dam structure. When the failure finally came, it happened with devastating speed. Geological evidence suggests that the ice dam didn't simply develop a leak that gradually widened over years or decades. Instead, it failed catastrophically, releasing the entire contents of Lake Missoula in a matter of days. The resulting flood was beyond anything in recorded human experience. Water depths reached over 400 feet in some areas, with flow velocities exceeding 60 miles per hour. The flood carved the Columbia River Gorge, stripped away hundreds of feet of sediment and rock, and deposited massive boulders hundreds of miles from their original locations. But here's what makes this story even more extraordinary. Lake Missoula filled and emptied multiple times. As the climate continued its complex dance between warming and cooling periods, the ice dam reformed. Water accumulated again. The cycle repeated. Geological evidence shows that this process occurred dozens of times over several thousand years, with each flood following roughly the same path and creating similar destruction. The repetitive nature of these floods explains some of the most puzzling features of the landscape in the Pacific Northwest. The channeled scablands of eastern Washington, with their distinctive pattern of deep channels and isolated hills, weren't carved by a single event, but by multiple catastrophic floods following the same routes again and again. Similar patterns of catastrophic flooding occurred across the globe as other ice-dammed lakes failed. In Siberia, massive lakes formed along the edges of the Eurasian ice sheet and released their contents in equally devastating floods. In northern Europe, ice-dammed lakes created floods that carved valleys and deposited sediments across vast areas. The timing of these floods wasn't random. They were connected to broader patterns of climate change that were affecting the entire planet. As orbital cycles slowly shifted Earth's relationship with the Sun, ice sheets began destabilizing in multiple locations simultaneously. This created a cascade effect where each flood contributed to further destabilization of the global ice system. The fresh water from these floods didn't simply flow into the oceans and disappear. It fundamentally altered the circulation patterns that regulate global climate. The North Atlantic, in particular, experienced massive influxes of fresh water that disrupted the normal circulation patterns responsible for transporting warm water from the tropics to northern regions. This disruption triggered what scientists call the Younger Dryas period, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions that lasted for over 1,000 years. Despite the overall warming trend that was ending the Ice Age, this massive influx of fresh water effectively shut down the ocean circulation system, causing temperatures to plummet across much of the northern hemisphere. The Younger Dryas demonstrates just how sensitive Earth's climate system can be to sudden changes. The planet had been steadily warming for several thousand years when the circulation shutdown occurred. Within decades, temperatures dropped back to levels approaching those of the full Ice Age. Ice sheets that had been retreating began advancing again. Forests that had been expanding northward retreated or died off entirely. What's particularly striking about the Younger Dryas is how abruptly it ended. After more than a millennium of renewed cold conditions, the climate system suddenly flipped back to its warming trend. Ice core data from Greenland shows that this transition occurred over a period of just a few decades, with some changes happening so rapidly they can be detected within individual annual layers of ice. This rapid switching between climate states reveals something crucial about how Earth systems operate. They don't change gradually and smoothly. Instead, they can remain relatively stable for long periods before suddenly shifting to entirely different configurations. These transitions often happen faster than ecosystems can adapt, leading to massive reorganizations of plant and animal communities. The archaeological record from this period shows clear evidence of human populations struggling to adapt to these rapid environmental changes. Tool technologies shifted dramatically. Settlement patterns changed. Population densities declined in many regions as traditional food sources became unreliable or disappeared entirely. In North America, the Clovis culture, which had been highly successful hunters of large mammals, largely disappeared during this period. Whether this was due to climate change, the extinction of their primary prey species, or some combination of factors remains a subject of scientific debate. But the timing strongly suggests that the environmental upheaval played a significant role. European populations also show clear signs of stress during this period. Archaeological sites from the Younger Dryas show evidence of reduced population sizes, changes in subsistence strategies, and increased mobility as groups were forced to abandon traditional territories that could no longer support them. Yet humans survived these dramatic changes, demonstrating remarkable adaptability in the face of environmental catastrophe. The genetic evidence suggests that while populations were severely stressed, they maintained enough diversity to recover and expand once conditions stabilized. The survivors carried with them not just their genes, but their knowledge and cultural innovations developed during this period of extreme challenge. The floods that triggered these massive climate disruptions left permanent marks on the landscape that are still visible today. The Columbia River Gorge, carved by the Missoula floods, remains one of the most dramatic river gorges in North America. The channeled scablands of Washington state preserve the pattern of flood channels in striking detail. Giant current ripples, some with wavelengths exceeding 300 feet, mark the paths of these ancient torrents. In the Great Lakes region, massive flood channels record the sudden drainage of glacial lakes as ice dams failed and new outlets opened. The formation of the Great Lakes themselves was intimately connected to these catastrophic drainage events, with lake levels rising and falling dramatically as outlets were blocked and then suddenly cleared. The scale of landscape modification accomplished by these floods challenges our normal understanding of how quickly geology can change. Features that would typically require millions of years to develop through normal erosion processes were created in days or weeks. Entire river systems were rerouted. New valleys were excavated through solid bedrock. Ancient drainage patterns were completely obliterated and replaced with entirely new configurations. These rapid changes had profound implications for the plants and animals trying to survive in these landscapes. Entire ecosystems were literally washed away and had to reassemble from scratch in the aftermath of each flood. The speed of these changes meant that adaptation had to happen quickly, or species faced local extinction. As we continue our journey through this remarkable period in Earth's history, we'll explore how these catastrophic floods ultimately created the stable world that allowed human civilization to develop, and examine the sobering lessons they offer about the potential for rapid environmental change in our own time. The geological evidence for these massive floods extends far beyond the obvious channels and scoured landscapes. Scientists have discovered that the sedimentary record itself tells a story of catastrophic water releases that fundamentally altered the planet's surface in ways we're only beginning to fully appreciate. Deep beneath the ocean floors, layers of sediment preserve a detailed chronicle of these ancient floods. When massive volumes of fresh water and debris suddenly poured into the seas, they created distinctive signatures that remain embedded in the seafloor today. These sediment layers are dramatically different from the fine, evenly distributed particles that normally settle onto the ocean bottom over thousands of years. Instead, researchers find thick bands of coarse material mixed chaotically with fine sediments, creating what geologists call turbidites. These deposits form only when enormous volumes of water carrying massive amounts of debris suddenly enter marine environments. The particle sizes are completely mixed together, from tiny clay fragments to sand and gravel, indicating that the water was moving with such force that it could transport materials of vastly different weights simultaneously. The chemical composition of these flood deposits tells an equally compelling story. When scientists analyze the isotopic signatures within these sediment layers, they find clear evidence of massive freshwater inputs into marine environments. The ratios of oxygen isotopes shift dramatically, indicating sudden dilution of normal seawater with enormous volumes of glacial meltwater. These chemical fingerprints allow researchers to trace the sources of the floodwaters. Different ice sheets and glacial lakes had slightly different isotopic compositions based on their age, elevation, and geographic location. By analyzing these signatures, scientists can determine not just that massive floods occurred, but specifically which ice masses contributed water to each flood event. The timing of these deposits provides crucial evidence for understanding the sequence of ice sheet collapses. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials trapped within the flood sediments, combined with other dating techniques, reveals that these catastrophic releases didn't happen randomly. They occurred in clusters, suggesting that the destabilization of one ice mass often triggered the failure of others. This cascading effect makes perfect sense when we consider the interconnected nature of Earth's climate system. When one massive ice sheet suddenly released its water, the resulting changes in ocean circulation and atmospheric patterns created stresses on other ice masses thousands of miles away. The planet was experiencing a global reorganization of its water cycle, with feedback loops that amplified the effects of each individual collapse. The marine sediment record also reveals something remarkable about the speed of these events. Normal oceanic sedimentation occurs so slowly that individual annual layers are often indistinguishable. But the flood deposits show clear evidence of rapid deposition, with some layers representing the accumulation of centuries' worth of normal sedimentation compressed into single events lasting days or weeks. On land, the evidence is equally dramatic, but preserved in different ways. The flood channels carved by these massive water releases created landscapes unlike anything formed by normal river processes. Traditional rivers meander, creating broad valleys with gradually sloping sides and complex patterns of erosion and deposition. The flood channels are dramatically different, cutting straight paths through the landscape with steep sides and relatively flat bottoms. The size of these channels defies comprehension. Some exceed 20 miles in width and hundreds of feet in depth, extending for hundreds of miles across the landscape. The channeled scablands of eastern Washington provide perhaps the most spectacular example, where dozens of these massive channels create a landscape that looks almost alien when viewed from above. Within these channels, scientists have discovered another type of evidence that speaks to the incredible power of these floods. Giant current ripples, formed by the interaction between fast-moving water and the sediment it carries, stretch across valley floors with wavelengths that can exceed several hundred feet. These ripples are so large that early researchers didn't recognize them as water-formed features, assuming instead that they were hills formed by other geological processes. The formation of these giant ripples requires very specific conditions that simply don't exist in normal river environments. The water must be moving at extremely high velocities while carrying enormous amounts of sediment. The depth must be sufficient to allow the formation of a large-scale turbulence patterns. These conditions are met only during catastrophic flood events of the type that occurred during the Ice Age collapse. Boulder fields provide another form of evidence that challenges our understanding of water's erosive power. Scattered across the flood paths are massive rocks, some weighing hundreds of tons, that were plucked from their original locations and transported dozens or even hundreds of miles. The size and distribution of these boulders allows scientists to calculate the minimum velocities and depths required for their transport. These calculations reveal flood characteristics that seem almost impossible. Water depths of several hundred feet moving at velocities exceeding 50 miles per hour over areas spanning thousands of square miles. The amount of energy represented by such flows exceeds the combined power of all the world's rivers flowing simultaneously. The repetitive nature of these floods becomes clear when examining the layered deposits they left behind. Rather than single massive deposits, researchers often find multiple layers separated by thinner intervals of normal sediment. This pattern indicates that the flooding process repeated multiple times, with periods of normal conditions between catastrophic events. Lake Missoula provides the best documented example of this repetitive flooding. Geological evidence suggests that the ice dam reformed and failed at least 40 times over a period of several thousand years. Each cycle followed a similar pattern. Gradual lake filling as the ice dam held. Catastrophic failure when the dam could no longer contain the water. Dramatic flooding across the Pacific Northwest. And then reformation of the dam as ice advanced again. The periodicity of these floods appears to be related to broader climate oscillations that were affecting the entire ice sheet system. As global temperatures fluctuated during the overall warming trend, ice sheets advanced and retreated in complex patterns that created windows of vulnerability when catastrophic drainage became likely. This connection between regional floods and global climate patterns helps explain why similar flood evidence appears on multiple continents during the same general time period. The Siberian landscape shows clear evidence of massive floods from ice-dammed lakes along the edges of the Eurasian ice sheet. Northern Europe preserves flood deposits and channels created by similar catastrophic drainage events. The synchronization of these events across vast distances demonstrates that the end of the Ice Age wasn't a gradual, regionally variable process. Instead, it was a globally coordinated transformation driven by fundamental changes in Earth's energy balance. When ice sheets began destabilizing in one region, the resulting climate changes created conditions that made similar destabilization likely elsewhere. The biological consequences of these floods were equally dramatic. Paleontological evidence shows clear disruptions in plant and animal communities coinciding with the flood events. Pollen records from lake sediments reveal sudden changes in vegetation patterns, with established forest communities replaced by pioneer species adapted to disturbed environments. Many large mammal species that had thrived during the Ice Age disappeared during this period of environmental upheaval. While multiple factors likely contributed to these extinctions, the timing strongly suggests that habitat disruption from catastrophic flooding played a significant role. Species adapted to stable Ice Age conditions found themselves in rapidly changing landscapes where traditional migration routes and feeding areas no longer existed. The archaeological record provides compelling evidence that human populations were directly affected by these environmental changes. Sites that show continuous occupation for thousands of years are suddenly abandoned during periods coinciding with major flood events. When reoccupation occurs, it often involves different cultural groups with distinct tool technologies and subsistence strategies. These population disruptions appear to have triggered significant cultural innovations. New tool technologies emerged that were better suited to the changing environment. Social organization patterns shifted to accommodate increased mobility and resource uncertainty. Trade networks expanded as groups sought to maintain access to resources that were no longer locally available. The genetic legacy of these population bottlenecks can still be detected in modern human populations. Molecular studies reveal signatures of population constrictions that occurred during the late Ice Age, followed by rapid expansion as conditions stabilized. These patterns suggest that while human populations survived the catastrophic environmental changes, they did so with significantly reduced numbers and increased genetic mixing between previously isolated groups. As we examine the full scope of these catastrophic floods and their consequences, a picture emerges of a planet undergoing transformation on a scale that modern humans have never experienced. The floods weren't just local disasters, but global reorganization events that reshaped continents, altered ocean circulation, and created the geographical foundation upon which human civilization would eventually develop. The lessons embedded in this geological record extend far beyond academic interest. They reveal fundamental truths about how Earth's systems respond to stress, how quickly stable conditions can change, and how resilient life can be in the face of catastrophic environmental disruption. The world we inhabit today was literally carved from the aftermath of these ancient catastrophes, reminding us that even the most dramatic changes can ultimately create conditions for new forms of flourishing. But perhaps the most profound changes weren't happening on the land at all. They were occurring deep within the ocean itself, where the sudden influx of fresh water from these catastrophic floods was triggering a complete reorganization of global circulation patterns that would affect every corner of the planet. The ocean currents that we take for granted today are driven by a delicate balance of temperature and salinity differences. Warm, salty water from the tropics flows northward, while cold, dense water sinks in polar regions and flows back toward the equator along the ocean floor. This massive conveyor belt of water transports heat around the globe and helps regulate climate patterns that billions of organisms depend upon. When the Ice Age floods dumped enormous volumes of fresh water into the North Atlantic, they fundamentally disrupted this system. Fresh water is less dense than salt water, so instead of sinking and driving circulation, it spread across the ocean surface like a lid, preventing the normal exchange between surface and deep waters. The great oceanic conveyor belt that had been running for thousands of years suddenly ground to a halt. The consequences were felt almost immediately across the entire northern hemisphere. Without warm water flowing northward from the tropics, regions that had been experiencing gradual warming suddenly plunged back into near glacial conditions. This wasn't a slow cooling process. Ice core data from Greenland shows that temperatures dropped by as much as 15 degrees Fahrenheit within a single decade. This period, known as the Younger Dryas, demonstrates just how sensitive Earth's climate system can be to sudden changes. The planet had been steadily warming for several thousand years when the circulation shutdown occurred. Ice sheets had been retreating, sea levels had been rising, and ecosystems had been adapting to gradually warming conditions. Then, almost overnight in geological terms, the warming stopped and reversed. For more than 1,000 years, much of the planet remained locked in this climate reversal. Ice sheets that had been shrinking began growing again. Glaciers advanced back into valleys they had recently vacated. In Europe, forests that had been expanding northward died back or were replaced by cold-adapted species. The mammoth steppe ecosystem, which had been in decline, experienced a brief resurgence as tundra conditions returned to vast areas. The archaeological record from this period tells a story of human populations under severe stress. The Clovis culture of North America, which had been highly successful hunters specializing in large mammals, largely disappeared during the Younger Dryas. Whether this was due to climate change, the extinction of their primary prey species, or competition with other human groups remains debated, but the timing is too precise to be coincidental. In Europe, human populations show clear signs of adapting to renewed harsh conditions. Tool technologies shifted toward designs better suited for processing plant foods and smaller game animals. Settlement patterns changed as groups were forced to abandon territories that could no longer support them. Population densities declined dramatically in many regions. Yet the most remarkable aspect of the Younger Dryas wasn't how it began, but how it ended. After more than a millennium of cold conditions, the climate system suddenly flipped back to its warming trend. The transition was astonishingly rapid, occurring over just a few decades. Ocean circulation resumed, temperatures soared, and ice sheets began their final retreat. This abrupt warming marked the true end of the Ice Age and the beginning of the Holocene epoch in which we still live today. But the scars left by the catastrophic floods that had triggered this climate disruption would remain embedded in the landscape forever, creating the geographical foundation upon which human civilization would eventually develop. The rapid melting that followed the end of the Younger Dryas created one final pulse of flooding, though this time the effects were more gradual and widespread rather than concentrated in massive regional events. As the last great ice sheets collapsed, sea levels rose by several hundred feet over the course of a few thousand years, drowning vast coastal plains and fundamentally altering the map of the world. One of the most dramatic examples of this final flooding occurred in what is now the North Sea. For thousands of years during the Ice Age, a vast landmass called Doggerland had connected Britain to continental Europe. This was no narrow land bridge, but a substantial territory roughly the size of modern England, complete with rivers, forests, and thriving ecosystems. As sea levels rose following the Ice Age, Doggerland was gradually submerged. Archaeological evidence recovered from the sea floor reveals that this was a rich landscape that supported substantial human populations. Stone tools, worked bone, and even wooden structures have been recovered from beneath the waves, providing glimpses of communities that were forced to abandon their homeland as the waters rose. The loss of Doggerland wasn't just a local tragedy. It represents the fate of countless coastal regions around the world that were drowned as Ice Age water returned to the oceans. Conservative estimates suggest that an area roughly equivalent to the combined size of India and China disappeared beneath the waves during this period. These weren't barren wastelands, but often the most productive and densely populated regions of their time. The drowning of these coastal plains had profound effects on human populations worldwide. Genetic studies reveal clear signatures of population bottlenecks and migrations during this period, as groups were forced to move inland and compete for increasingly scarce territory. The survivors of these displacements carried with them not just their genes, but their cultural knowledge and technological innovations. In many parts of the world, oral traditions preserve memories of these great floods. Stories of rising waters, lost lands, and forced migrations appear in the folklore of cultures from Australia to Scandinavia to the Americas. While these stories have often been dismissed as mythology, modern archaeological and geological research increasingly suggests that many may preserve genuine cultural memories of real environmental catastrophes. The end of the Ice Age floods also marked the beginning of modern river systems. Many of the world's great rivers follow courses that were established during this period of catastrophic drainage. The Mississippi River, for example, was largely shaped by the drainage of glacial Lake Agassiz, a body of water larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined. When Lake Agassiz finally drained, it didn't empty gradually over centuries. Instead, it released its contents in a series of catastrophic floods that carved the modern Mississippi Valley and deposited enormous sediment loads in the Gulf of Mexico. Similar drainage events shaped major river systems across North America and Eurasia, creating the waterways that would become crucial transportation routes for later human civilizations. The Amazon basin provides another example of how Ice Age flooding events continued to shape landscapes long after the ice had melted. As Andean glaciers retreated, they released enormous volumes of water that carved new valleys and deposited vast alluvial plains. These fertile sediments would eventually support some of the most complex pre-Columbian civilizations in South America. In Asia, the formation of modern river systems was equally dramatic. The Ganges, Yangtze, and Yellow rivers all bear the signatures of catastrophic drainage events that occurred as Himalayan and Tibetan ice masses collapsed. The sediments deposited by these floods created some of the world's most fertile agricultural regions, supporting the development of major civilizations in India and China. The atmospheric consequences of these massive water movements were equally significant. As enormous volumes of water evaporated from newly formed lakes and flooded regions, global precipitation patterns shifted dramatically. Some regions that had been dry during the Ice Age suddenly received abundant rainfall, while others experienced prolonged droughts as storm tracks reorganized. The Sahara Desert provides a striking example of these atmospheric changes. During the early Holocene, increased monsoon activity turned much of North Africa into grassland and woodland. Archaeological evidence reveals that this green Sahara supported substantial human and animal populations for several thousand years, before gradually drying out as atmospheric circulation patterns continued to evolve. These regional climate changes had cascading effects on plant and animal communities worldwide. Species that had been confined to small refugia during the Ice Age suddenly found vast new territories available for colonization. Forests expanded rapidly across previously glaciated landscapes. Grasslands spread into regions that had been too dry or cold to support them. The speed of these ecological changes was unprecedented. Pollen records from lake sediments show that entire forest ecosystems assembled themselves within centuries rather than the millennia typically required for such large-scale vegetation changes. Species that had been separated by ice sheets for tens of thousands of years suddenly came back into contact, creating new competitive pressures and evolutionary opportunities. Large mammal communities were particularly affected by these rapid environmental changes. Many Ice Age species that had survived the initial climate warming couldn't adapt to the speed of habitat transformation that followed. Mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and dozens of other species disappeared during this period of rapid ecological reorganization. The extinction of these megafauna had profound effects on ecosystem function. Large herbivores had maintained open grassland ecosystems through their grazing activities. Without them, forests expanded into regions that had been grassland for thousands of years. Predator-prey relationships were completely restructured as top predators lost their primary food sources. Human populations were both witnesses to and participants in these massive ecological changes. The archaeological record shows clear evidence of hunting intensification as traditional prey species became scarce. New technologies emerged for exploiting previously unused resources. Social organization patterns shifted as groups adapted to rapidly changing environmental conditions. The development of agriculture during this period wasn't coincidental. The environmental instability created by the End Ice Age floods may have provided the evolutionary pressure that drove humans to develop food production systems. Wild plant and animal populations had become unreliable due to rapid habitat changes, making cultivation and domestication increasingly attractive survival strategies. The first agricultural systems emerged in regions that had been heavily affected by Ice Age flooding and subsequent environmental changes. The Fertile Crescent, where agriculture first developed in the Old World, was shaped by floods from melting Turkish and Iranian glaciers. The floodplains created by these events provided the fertile soils and reliable water sources that made early farming possible. Similar patterns appear in other regions where agriculture developed independently. The Yellow and Yangtze River valleys in China, the Indus Valley in Pakistan, and the coastal plains of Peru all bear the geological signatures of Ice Age flooding events. The rich soils and predictable water sources created by these ancient catastrophes provided the foundation for some of humanity's earliest civilizations. As we examine the full scope of how Ice Age floods shaped our world, a remarkable pattern emerges. The very catastrophes that destroyed existing ecosystems and displaced countless species also created the conditions that would allow new forms of life to flourish. The floods that carved new river valleys also created the fertile plains where agriculture would develop. The rising seas that drowned coastal civilizations also created the harbours and estuaries where maritime trade would later flourish. The modern world we inhabit was literally carved from the aftermath of these ancient catastrophes. Every major river system, every fertile valley, every accessible coastline bears the signature of the great floods that ended the Ice Age. The stable climate that allowed human civilization to develop emerged from this period of unprecedented environmental upheaval. Understanding this history provides crucial perspective on the relationship between catastrophic change and evolutionary innovation. The greatest environmental disasters in Earth's recent past weren't just destructive events, but creative forces that opened new ecological niches and evolutionary pathways. The floods that ended the Ice Age didn't just destroy an old world, they created a new one. This creative destruction continues to shape our planet today, though at a much reduced scale. Modern floods, while devastating from a human perspective, pale in comparison to the continent reshaping events of the late Ice Age. Yet they follow the same basic principles, carving new channels, depositing fresh sediments, and creating opportunities for ecological innovation. The lesson embedded in this geological record extends far beyond academic interest. It reveals that even the most stable appearing systems can undergo rapid transformation when critical thresholds are crossed. The ice sheets that had seemed permanent for thousands of years collapsed within centuries. Ocean circulation patterns that had operated steadily for millennia shut down within decades. Human societies that had adapted successfully to Ice Age conditions found themselves forced to completely reorganize their ways of life as the environmental foundations of their world shifted beneath them. Yet they survived, adapted, and ultimately thrived in the new world created by these catastrophic changes. The great floods that ended the Ice Age represent one of the most dramatic examples of rapid environmental change in Earth's recent history. They demonstrate both the fragility of seemingly stable systems and the remarkable resilience of life in the face of catastrophic disruption. The world we know today exists because our ancestors survived these ultimate tests of adaptability, carrying forward not just their genes, but their accumulated knowledge and cultural innovations into the stable world that followed. As we face our own period of rapid environmental change, the story of these ancient floods offers both sobering warnings about the speed at which stable conditions can collapse and inspiring examples of life's ability to not just survive, but ultimately flourish in the aftermath of catastrophe. The floods that ended the Ice Age didn't just change the world, they created the world, reminding us that even the most dramatic changes can ultimately become the foundation for new forms of beauty and complexity. The evidence hidden within ice cores tells perhaps the most precise story of how rapidly these changes unfolded. Deep within the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, scientists have extracted cylinders of frozen time that preserve the actual atmosphere from thousands of years ago. Each annual layer of ice contains tiny bubbles of ancient air, sealed away like messages from a vanished world. When researchers analyze these ice cores, they discover something remarkable about the timing of the great floods. The atmospheric composition doesn't shift gradually over centuries as you might expect from slow climate change. Instead, the chemical signatures jump dramatically within just a few annual layers, indicating that major atmospheric changes occurred within decades or even single years. The carbon dioxide levels preserved in these ice bubbles reveal sudden spikes that coincide exactly with the timing of the Great Flood events. As massive volumes of organic material were suddenly exposed by retreating ice and catastrophic drainage, decomposition released enormous amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The planet's carbon cycle was thrown into chaos almost overnight. Methane concentrations tell an even more dramatic story. This powerful greenhouse gas spiked to levels far exceeding anything in the previous 100,000 years of ice core records. The sudden warming and flooding had destabilized vast areas of permafrost and wetlands, releasing methane that had been locked away for millennia. These atmospheric changes created feedback loops that accelerated the warming process, far beyond what orbital cycles alone could explain. The isotopic composition of the trapped air reveals the global nature of these changes. Oxygen isotopes shift in patterns that indicate massive reorganization of the water cycle. Dust levels fluctuate wildly, showing periods when vast areas of newly exposed land were stripped bare by wind erosion. The atmosphere itself was responding to a planet in the midst of fundamental transformation. But perhaps the most striking evidence comes from what geologists call Heinrich events. Massive armadas of icebergs that were discharged into the North Atlantic during periods of ice sheet instability. These weren't ordinary icebergs carving from stable ice sheets. They were continent-sized masses of ice that broke away when the internal structure of ice sheets collapsed catastrophically. The evidence for these Heinrich events is preserved in ocean sediments as distinctive layers of rock debris that could only have been transported by floating ice. When scientists map the distribution of these debris layers, they reveal iceberg armadas that stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. Some individual icebergs were the size of small countries, carrying with them massive loads of rock and sediment scraped from the continents. The timing of Heinrich events correlates precisely with the periods of catastrophic flooding on land. As ice sheets collapsed internally, they didn't just release water gradually, they broke apart into massive fragments that drifted across the oceans, melting slowly and dumping their sediment loads across vast areas of sea floor. These events represent some of the most rapid ice mass losses in Earth's recent history. The scale of these iceberg discharges challenges our understanding of ice sheet behavior. Traditional models suggested that ice sheets should retreat gradually and predictably as temperatures warm. But the Heinrich events reveal that ice sheets can collapse catastrophically once internal stress exceeds critical thresholds. The same mechanisms that created these ancient iceberg armadas operate within modern ice sheets today. Marine sediment cores from around the world preserve additional evidence of the global synchronization of these events. Distinctive chemical signatures appear simultaneously in ocean basins, separated by thousands of miles, indicating that the effects of ice sheet collapse were felt planet-wide within very short time periods. The ocean circulation system that connects all of Earth's seas carried the signals of catastrophic change to every corner of the globe. Deep sea drilling has revealed layers of unusual sediment that can only be explained by sudden, massive inputs of fresh water and debris. These turbidite deposits formed when enormous volumes of meltwater carrying suspended sediment poured into the oceans with such force that they triggered underwater avalanches along continental slopes. The resulting deposits spread across abyssal plains, creating geological signatures of catastrophic drainage that remain visible millions of years later. The biological consequences preserved in these marine sediments are equally dramatic. Microscopic organisms that lived in the surface waters of the oceans show sudden population crashes and species replacements that coincide with the flood events. These weren't gradual evolutionary changes, but ecological catastrophes that eliminated entire communities of marine life within decades. Foraminifera, tiny shelled organisms whose fossils accumulate on the ocean floor, provide a detailed record of how ocean chemistry changed during these events. Their shells incorporate chemical signatures from the water in which they lived, creating a chemical archive of past ocean conditions. During flood events, these signatures show massive dilution of seawater with fresh water, dramatic temperature changes, and complete disruptions of normal nutrient cycling. Coral reefs from this period tell a particularly poignant story of rapid environmental change. Corals are extremely sensitive to changes in water temperature, chemistry, and sea level. They grow slowly upward toward the light, creating structures that can persist for thousands of years. But when sea level rises too quickly, corals are left behind in water too deep for them to survive. The coral fossil record from the end of the Ice Age shows repeated episodes of sudden drowning. Reefs that had been growing successfully for centuries were abruptly abandoned as sea levels jumped upward in rapid pulses. New reefs then began growing at higher elevations, only to be drowned again when the next pulse of meltwater reached the oceans. This pattern of stepped drowning events provides some of the most precise evidence for the pulsed nature of Ice Age flooding. The geographic distribution of drowned reefs reveals that sea level didn't rise uniformly around the globe. Some regions experienced much more dramatic rises than others, reflecting the complex patterns of ice sheet collapse and gravitational effects. When massive ice sheets disintegrated, their gravitational pull on the oceans weakened, causing water to redistribute unevenly across the planet's surface. This uneven sea level rise had profound implications for coastal ecosystems and human populations. Some regions that had been well above sea level suddenly found themselves underwater, while others experienced more modest changes. The archaeological record shows clear evidence of human populations being forced to abandon coastal settlements as rising waters made their traditional territories uninhabitable. In the Pacific, island chains preserve evidence of sudden sea level changes that stranded coral reefs far above modern water levels in some areas while drowning others completely. These patterns reflect the complex interplay between global sea level rise, regional geological processes, and the gravitational effects of ice sheet collapse. Each island tells a slightly different story, but together they paint a picture of a world where the boundary between land and sea was rapidly and dramatically redrawn. The biological response to these rapid changes wasn't limited to marine environments. Terrestrial ecosystems experienced equally dramatic reorganizations as habitats were flooded, drained, or completely transformed within decades. Pollen records from lake sediments reveal sudden shifts in vegetation patterns that would normally take millennia to develop. In North America, spruce forests that had dominated the landscape for thousands of years were suddenly replaced by deciduous hardwood forests as warming accelerated. But this wasn't a gradual transition. Pollen diagrams show sharp boundaries where one forest type disappears almost entirely within a few decades and is replaced by completely different plant communities. The speed of these vegetation changes suggests that ecosystems didn't have time for gradual adaptation. Instead, they collapsed and reassembled with entirely new species compositions. Plants and animals that had coexisted for thousands of years were suddenly separated as their habitats shifted faster than they could migrate. New ecological communities formed from species that had never previously interacted. Large mammal communities were particularly vulnerable to these rapid habitat changes. Many species that had successfully adapted to Ice Age conditions found themselves in landscapes that no longer provided suitable habitat. Mammoths, giant ground sloths, cave bears, and dozens of other species disappeared during this period of rapid environmental transformation. The extinction patterns don't suggest gradual decline due to slow climate change. Instead, they show sudden disappearances that coincide with major flood events and rapid habitat transformation. Species that had survived previous climate fluctuations couldn't cope with the speed and magnitude of changes triggered by a catastrophic ice sheet collapse. Human populations were both witnesses to and participants in these massive environmental changes. Archaeological sites from this period show clear evidence of rapid cultural adaptation to changing conditions. Tool technologies shifted dramatically as traditional resources became unavailable. Settlement patterns changed as groups were forced to abandon territories that could no longer support them. The genetic legacy of these environmental catastrophes can still be detected in modern human populations. Molecular studies reveal signatures of population bottlenecks that occurred during the late Ice Age, followed by rapid expansion as conditions stabilized. These patterns suggest that while human populations survived the catastrophic changes, they did so with significantly reduced numbers and increased mixing between previously isolated groups. Perhaps most remarkably, some human oral traditions appear to preserve actual memories of these catastrophic events. Stories of great floods, rising waters, and lost lands appear in the folklore of cultures around the world. While these traditions have often been dismissed as mythology, modern archaeological and geological research increasingly suggests that many may preserve genuine cultural memories of real environmental catastrophes. The Aboriginal peoples of Australia, for example, have oral traditions describing the flooding of coastal plains and the formation of islands that correlate remarkably well with archaeological evidence of late Ice Age sea level rise. Similarly, flood stories from the Pacific Northwest align with the geological evidence for catastrophic drainage of glacial lakes in the region. These oral traditions represent an extraordinary form of cultural memory, preserving information about environmental events that occurred thousands of years before written history. They demonstrate that human societies not only survived these catastrophic changes, but maintained cultural continuity across periods of unprecedented environmental upheaval. The technological innovations that emerged during this period of environmental stress would prove crucial for humanity's future development. New hunting technologies, improved food processing techniques, and more efficient tools all appeared during the late Ice Age as human populations adapted to rapidly changing conditions. The development of more sophisticated projectile weapons, for example, may have been driven by the need to hunt smaller, faster prey as large Ice Age mammals disappeared. Improvements in plant processing technologies became crucial as groups were forced to rely more heavily on vegetation as animal resources became scarce or unpredictable. social innovations were equally important. Evidence suggests that trade networks expanded during this period as groups sought to maintain access to resources that were no longer locally available. New forms of social organization emerged that emphasized mobility and flexibility over the more sedentary patterns that had characterized some Ice Age societies. The artistic record from this period also shows dramatic changes that may reflect the psychological impact of living through unprecedented environmental upheaval. Cave art traditions that had remained relatively stable for thousands of years suddenly show new themes and techniques. Human figures become more prominent, often depicted in dynamic poses that suggest movement or flight. Animal depictions shift from the large Ice Age mammals that had dominated earlier art towards smaller species and more abstract representations. These changes may reflect not just the extinction of large mammals, but also fundamental shifts in how humans understood their relationship with the natural world as familiar landscapes disappeared and new ones emerged. The end of the Great Floods marked the beginning of the Holocene epoch, the geological period in which we still live today. But the transition wasn't immediate or complete. Smaller flood events continued for thousands of years as remaining ice masses adjusted to the new climate conditions. Each pulse of meltwater contributed to the ongoing reshaping of landscapes and ecosystems. The final drainage of glacial Lake Agassiz around 8,000 years ago sent one last massive pulse of fresh water into the North Atlantic, triggering a brief return to cooler conditions known as the 8.2 kilo-year event. This final flood demonstrates that even after the major ice sheets had disappeared, the planet's climate system remained sensitive to sudden inputs of fresh water. The landscapes created by these catastrophic floods would provide the foundation for human civilization's development. The fertile river valleys carved by floodwaters became the cradles of agriculture. The harbours and estuaries created by rising sea levels provided the ports where maritime trade would flourish. The stable coastlines that emerged after the flooding ended gave human societies the predictable boundaries they needed for long-term development. Modern river systems still follow the courses established by Ice Age floods. The Mississippi, Amazon, Ganges, and dozens of other major rivers flow through valleys that were carved or significantly modified by catastrophic drainage events. The sediments deposited by these ancient floods created some of the world's most fertile agricultural soils, supporting the development of major civilizations. The great floods that ended the Ice Age represent one of the most dramatic examples of rapid environmental change in Earth's recent history. They demonstrate that stable-appearing systems can undergo catastrophic transformation when critical thresholds are exceeded. They reveal the remarkable resilience of life in the face of unprecedented disruption, and they remind us that the world we inhabit today was literally carved from the aftermath of these ancient catastrophes. As we face our own period of rapid environmental change, the story of these Ice Age floods offers crucial insights into how Earth systems respond to stress and how life adapts to catastrophic disruption. The floods that ended the Ice Age didn't just destroy an old world. They created the new world in which human civilization would ultimately flourish, demonstrating that even the most dramatic changes can become the foundation for new forms of complexity and beauty. The evidence preserved in ancient lake beds reveals another dimension to these catastrophic events that scientists are only now beginning to fully understand. When massive ice dams failed and released their stored water, they didn't just carve channels and scour landscapes. They created temporary inland seas that existed for mere decades, but left geological signatures that persist to this day. Lake Bonneville in what is now Utah provides one of the most well-documented examples of these ephemeral giants. At its maximum extent, this ancient lake covered an area roughly the size of Lake Superior, held back by natural barriers of rock and sediment. When rising water levels finally overtopped the lowest point in the basin's rim, the resulting overflow carved the massive Snake River Canyon in a matter of weeks. The geological evidence for this catastrophic drainage is preserved in spectacular detail throughout the region. Wave-cut terraces high above the modern desert floor mark the ancient shorelines where Lake Bonneville's waters once lapped against mountain slopes. These terraces aren't weathered and eroded like features that formed slowly over millions of years. They're sharp, distinct, and perfectly preserved, indicating they were formed quickly and then abandoned as water levels dropped precipitously. Below these ancient shorelines, the landscape bears the unmistakable marks of catastrophic drainage. The Snake River Canyon itself defies explanation through normal erosion processes. Rivers typically carve valleys slowly, meandering back and forth over millions of years to create broad, gently sloping valleys. But the Snake River Canyon is different. It's narrow, steep-sided, and cuts straight through solid basalt for hundreds of miles. The scale of water flow required to carve such a channel can be calculated from the size and shape of the canyon itself. Hydrologists estimate that the peak discharge from Lake Bonneville exceeded 15 million cubic feet per second, making it one of the largest floods in Earth's recent history. For comparison, the Amazon River, the largest river in the world today, carries only about 7 million cubic feet per second at its peak flow. But Lake Bonneville wasn't unique. Similar catastrophic drainage events occurred across North America as dozens of ice-dammed lakes failed in sequence. Lake Missoula in Montana drained and refilled repeatedly, creating the channeled scablands of Washington. Lake Agassiz, larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined, released its waters through various outlets as ice dams shifted and failed. The timing of these drainage events wasn't random. They occurred in clusters as climate warming destabilized ice dams across entire regions simultaneously. When one major lake drained catastrophically, the resulting changes in atmospheric circulation and ocean currents created conditions that made similar failures likely elsewhere. The planet was experiencing a cascade of interconnected collapses. In Siberia, even larger ice-dammed lakes formed along the margins of the massive Eurasian ice sheet. Lake Mansi, estimated to have been larger than the Caspian Sea, was held back by ice dams that eventually failed catastrophically. The resulting floods carved valleys across western Siberia and deposited enormous volumes of sediment into the Arctic Ocean. The failure of these Siberian lakes had global consequences. The sudden influx of fresh water into the Arctic Ocean disrupted circulation patterns that affected weather systems around the world. Paleoclimate records from as far away as South America show clear signatures of atmospheric changes that coincide with the timing of Siberian lake drainage events. These cascading failures reveal something crucial about how Earth's systems respond to stress. The planet doesn't simply absorb changes gradually and smoothly. Instead, it stores stress until critical thresholds are exceeded, then releases that stress through rapid, often violent adjustments that can affect the entire global system within decades. The biological consequences of these repeated catastrophic drainage events were profound and long-lasting. Each flood didn't just temporarily disrupt ecosystems, it permanently altered the evolutionary trajectories of entire species and communities. The fossil record from lake sediments shows that many aquatic species that had thrived in stable Ice Age lakes simply disappeared when their habitats were suddenly drained. Fish communities that had evolved in isolation for thousands of years were either eliminated entirely or forced to adapt rapidly to completely different river environments. Many endemic species of invertebrates, mollusks, and microscopic organisms vanished forever during these drainage events. The speed of change was simply too fast for gradual evolutionary adaptation. Terrestrial ecosystems experienced equally dramatic disruptions. Forests and grasslands that had developed around stable lake shores were suddenly left high and dry as water levels dropped hundreds of feet within years. The resulting ecological collapse created opportunities for entirely new plant and animal communities to establish themselves in the abandoned lake beds. These newly exposed lake floors often became some of the most fertile land in their regions. The sediments that had accumulated over thousands of years in calm lake waters were rich in nutrients and perfectly suited for plant growth. As vegetation quickly colonized these areas, they created new habitat corridors that allowed species to migrate across previously insurmountable barriers. The archaeological record shows that human populations were quick to recognize and exploit these newly available resources. Sites dating to the period immediately following major lake drainage events show evidence of intensive occupation of former lake beds. These areas provided not just fertile soil for early agricultural experiments, but also abundant game animals that were attracted to the lush vegetation. Tool technologies from this period show rapid innovation as human groups adapted to exploit new resource opportunities. Specialized fishing equipment disappeared from the archaeological record in regions where lakes had drained, replaced by new hunting technologies designed for the terrestrial animals that colonized the exposed lake beds. Trade networks also underwent major reorganization as traditional water routes disappeared overnight. Groups that had relied on lake travel for thousands of years were forced to develop overland transportation methods. This shift contributed to the development of more sophisticated portable technologies and the expansion of trade relationships across longer distances. The genetic consequences of these environmental disruptions can still be detected in modern populations of both humans and other species. Molecular studies of fish populations in the Great Lakes region reveal clear signatures of population bottlenecks and rapid expansion that occurred when glacial lakes drained and reformed in new configurations. Human populations show similar patterns of genetic reorganization during this period. Studies of mitochondrial DNA suggest that many North American populations experienced significant bottlenecks, followed by rapid expansion and mixing, as groups were forced to abandon traditional territories and seek new homes in radically altered landscapes. The cultural innovations that emerged during this period of environmental upheaval would have lasting impacts on human development. The necessity of adapting rapidly to changing conditions appears to have accelerated technological innovation and social organization changes that might otherwise have taken millennia to develop. New forms of social cooperation emerged as groups were forced to share resources and coordinate responses to environmental challenges that no single community could handle alone. These cooperative strategies would prove crucial as human populations eventually developed the complex societies that would lead to civilization. The artistic record from this period also shows remarkable creativity as human groups process the psychological impact of living through unprecedented environmental change. Rock art sites from this era often depict water-related themes and dramatic landscape features that may represent cultural memories of catastrophic flooding events. Perhaps most significantly, the technological foundations for agriculture were laid during this period of environmental stress. As traditional hunting and gathering resources became unreliable due to rapid habitat changes, human groups began experimenting with more intensive management of plant and animal resources. The fertile soils created by drained lake beds provided ideal conditions for these early agricultural experiments. Many of the world's first agricultural centers developed in regions that had been shaped by catastrophic lake drainage events. The Fertile Crescent, the Yellow River Valley in China, and the Central Valleys of Mexico all bear geological signatures of Ice Age flooding and drainage. The development of agriculture wasn't just a technological innovation, it was a survival strategy that emerged from necessity as traditional ways of life became impossible due to rapid environmental change. The catastrophic floods that ended the Ice Age didn't just reshape the physical landscape. They fundamentally altered the trajectory of human cultural evolution. As the great ice-dammed lakes drained and reformed, they created a world of temporary abundance followed by sudden scarcity. Human populations that could adapt quickly to these changing conditions thrived, while those that couldn't faced extinction or absorption into more successful groups. The survivors carried forward not just their genes, but their hard-won knowledge of how to survive in an unpredictable world. The hydrological legacy of these events continues to influence modern water systems. Many of today's rivers still follow courses that were established when catastrophic floods carved new valleys through existing watersheds. The Columbia River, the Missouri River, and dozens of other major waterways flow through channels that were created or significantly modified by Ice Age drainage events. Understanding the mechanics of these ancient floods has become increasingly important as scientists study modern ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica. The same processes that triggered catastrophic drainage in the past operate within contemporary ice masses, though on a smaller scale. Glaciologists use evidence from Ice Age floods to better understand how modern ice sheets might respond to continued warming. The geological record preserved in ocean sediments provides additional evidence for the global nature of these flooding events. When massive volumes of fresh water suddenly entered the oceans, they created distinctive chemical signatures that can be detected in seafloor sediments around the world. These signatures appear simultaneously in ocean basins separated by thousands of miles, confirming that the effects of Ice Age flooding were truly global in scope. Deep sea drilling has revealed that these flood signatures appear not just once, but repeatedly throughout the period when ice sheets were collapsing. Each major drainage event left its mark in marine sediments, creating a detailed chronology of catastrophic water releases that scientists can correlate with evidence from terrestrial sources. The marine biological record tells its own story of catastrophic change during this period. Microscopic organisms that lived in surface ocean waters show sudden population crashes and species replacements that coincide precisely with the timing of major flood events. These weren't gradual evolutionary changes, but ecological catastrophes that eliminated entire communities within decades. Coral reefs provide some of the most precise evidence for the pulsed nature of sea level rise during this period. Corals grow slowly upward toward the light, creating structures that can persist for thousands of years. But when sea level rises too quickly, corals are left behind in water too deep for survival. The fossil record shows repeated episodes of coral drowning events separated by periods of renewed growth at higher elevations. This pattern of step drowning provides clear evidence that sea level didn't rise smoothly during the Ice Age collapse, but jumped upward in rapid pulses as successive flood events reached the oceans. The atmospheric consequences of these massive water movements were equally dramatic. Ice core records show that each major flood event was followed by significant changes in greenhouse gas concentrations as newly exposed organic matter decomposed rapidly and permafrost areas were destabilized by warming temperatures. These atmospheric changes created feedback loops that accelerated the warming process far beyond what orbital cycles alone could explain. The floods that began as responses to gradual climate change became drivers of more rapid change as they released stored carbon and altered global circulation patterns. The end result was a planet that had been completely transformed within a few thousand years. Landscapes that had remained stable for tens of thousands of years were carved into entirely new configurations. Ocean circulation patterns that had operated consistently for millennia were reorganized. Atmospheric composition shifted dramatically as carbon that had been locked away in ice and permafrost was suddenly released. This period of catastrophic change created the geographical and climatic foundation for the modern world. The river systems carved by Ice Age floods became the transportation networks that would later support human civilization. The fertile valleys created by flood sediments became the agricultural centers where farming would first develop. The stable coastlines that emerged after the flooding ended provided the predictable boundaries that complex societies required. The great floods that ended the Ice Age represent one of the most dramatic examples of rapid environmental transformation in Earth's recent history. They demonstrate that stable-appearing systems can undergo catastrophic change when critical thresholds are exceeded. They reveal the remarkable capacity of life to not just survive, but ultimately thrive in the aftermath of unprecedented disruption. As we continue to explore the evidence for these ancient catastrophes, we gain crucial insights into how Earth's systems respond to stress and how quickly familiar landscapes can be transformed beyond recognition. The floods that ended the Ice Age didn't just mark the end of one era, they created the foundation for everything that would follow, reminding us that even the most dramatic changes can ultimately become the building blocks for new forms of beauty and complexity. The story preserved in these geological archives continues to unfold as new evidence emerges from ongoing research. Each ice core drilled, each sediment layer analysed, and each flood channel mapped adds detail to our understanding of how quickly and dramatically our planet can change when the right conditions align. The Great Floods remain as a testament to Earth's capacity for both destruction and creation, written permanently into the landscape for those who know how to read the signs. The evidence becomes even more compelling when we examine what scientists call the Heinrich events, named after the German marine geologist who first identified them in North Atlantic sediments. These weren't just ordinary periods of ice discharge. They represent some of the most massive and rapid ice sheet collapses in Earth's recent history. Events so dramatic that they left unmistakable signatures across multiple continents. Picture this: armadas of icebergs, some the size of small countries, breaking away from collapsing ice sheets and drifting across entire ocean basins. These weren't the relatively modest icebergs we see today carving from Greenland or Antarctica. Heinrich event icebergs carried with them massive loads of rock debris scraped from the North American continent, creating a trail of evidence that scientists can follow across thousands of miles of ocean floor. The sediment cores tell an incredible story, layer after layer of what geologists call ice-rafted debris, rocks and soil, that could only have been transported by floating ice, spread across the North Atlantic in distinctive bands. When researchers map the distribution of these debris layers, they reveal the paths of ancient iceberg armadas that stretched from the coast of North America all the way to Europe. The scale of these events challenges everything we thought we knew about ice sheet behavior. Traditional models suggested that ice sheets should respond gradually to climate change, retreating slowly and predictably as temperatures warm. But Heinrich events reveal something far more dramatic. They show that ice sheets can collapse catastrophically, releasing continent-sized chunks of ice within decades or even years. The timing of these events wasn't random. They occurred in clusters, often triggering additional collapses as the effects rippled through the global climate system. When massive ice sheets disintegrated, they didn't just affect local regions. They altered ocean circulation patterns worldwide, disrupted atmospheric circulation, and created conditions that made similar collapses likely elsewhere on the planet. The Laurentide ice sheet, which covered most of Canada and the northern United States, experienced multiple Heinrich events as its eastern margin collapsed repeatedly into the North Atlantic. Each collapse sent massive volumes of fresh water and ice into the ocean, disrupting the circulation patterns that regulate global climate. The effects were felt as far away as Antarctica and the tropical Pacific, but here's where the story becomes truly extraordinary. The collapse wasn't limited to ice sheets. The sudden drainage of massive glacial lakes created their own cascade of environmental changes that amplified the effects of ice sheet disintegration. Lake Agassiz, the largest of these ancient lakes, contained more water than all of the modern Great Lakes combined. When Lake Agassiz finally drained catastrophically around 8,000 years ago, it sent a pulse of fresh water into the North Atlantic so massive that it temporarily shut down the ocean circulation system that carries warm water northward from the tropics. This single drainage event triggered what scientists call the 8.2 kiloyear event, a brief return to near-glacial conditions that affected the entire northern hemisphere. The archaeological record from this period tells a sobering story of human societies under extreme environmental stress. The Clovis culture, which had been highly successful in North America for over 1,000 years, largely disappeared during this period of rapid climate change. Whether this was due to environmental pressures, the extinction of their primary prey species, or a combination of factors remains debated, but the timing is too precise to be coincidental. In Europe, the archaeological evidence shows clear signs of population stress during periods of rapid environmental change. Settlement patterns shifted dramatically as groups were forced to abandon territories that could no longer support them. Tool technologies evolved rapidly as traditional resources became scarce or unreliable. Trade networks expanded as communities sought to maintain access to materials that were no longer locally available. Yet, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this story is how life ultimately responded to these catastrophic changes. The floods that destroyed existing ecosystems also created entirely new habitats. The valleys carved by rushing water became fertile corridors for plant and animal migration. The sediments deposited by floods created some of the richest soils on the planet. River systems established during this period of catastrophic drainage continue to shape our world today. The Mississippi River follows a course that was largely determined by the drainage of glacial lake agassis. The Columbia River flows through a valley carved by the repeated flooding from Lake Missoula. The Great Lakes themselves were shaped by the complex interactions between ice sheet retreat and catastrophic drainage events. These ancient waterways didn't just create new geography, they established the transportation networks that would later support the development of human civilization. The fertile valleys created by flood deposits became the agricultural centers where farming first took hold. The harbors and estuaries formed by rising sea levels provided the natural ports where maritime trade would eventually flourish. The atmospheric record preserved in ice cores reveals another dimension to these changes that scientists are only now beginning to fully understand. Each major flood event triggered significant releases of greenhouse gases as organic matter that had been frozen for millennia suddenly thawed and decomposed. Methane concentrations spiked to levels far exceeding anything in the previous 100,000 years of climate records. These atmospheric changes created feedback loops that accelerated warming far beyond what orbital cycles alone could explain. The floods that began as responses to gradual climate change became drivers of more rapid change as they destabilized permafrost, exposed organic matter to decomposition, and altered the planet's energy balance in ways that are still being studied today. The marine environment tells its own story of catastrophic transformation during this period. When massive volumes of fresh water suddenly entered the oceans, they didn't just dilute the salt water, they fundamentally altered the density structure that drives ocean circulation. The results were felt globally as heat transport patterns shifted, causing some regions to warm dramatically, while others cooled unexpectedly. Coral reefs provide some of the most precise evidence for how rapidly these changes unfolded. Corals are extremely sensitive to changes in water temperature and chemistry, and they grow slowly enough that their skeletons preserve detailed records of environmental conditions. The coral record from the end of the Ice Age shows repeated episodes of sudden stress and recovery that coincide exactly with the timing of major flood events. In the Pacific, coral atolls preserve evidence of rapid sea level changes that left ancient reef systems stranded high above modern water levels in some areas, while completely drowning others. These patterns reflect the complex interactions between global sea level rise, regional geological processes, and the gravitational effects of ice sheet collapse. The biological consequences extended far beyond marine environments. Terrestrial ecosystems experienced equally dramatic reorganizations as habitats were flooded, drained, or completely transformed within single decades. Pollen records from lake sediments reveal sudden shifts in vegetation patterns that would normally take thousands of years to develop through gradual climate change. In North America, boreal forests that had dominated the landscape for millennia were suddenly replaced by temperate hardwood forests as warming accelerated beyond the tolerance limits of cold-adapted species. But this wasn't a gradual transition zone moving slowly northward. Instead, Pollen diagrams show sharp boundaries where one forest type disappears almost entirely within decades and is replaced by completely different plant communities. The speed of these changes meant that many species couldn't migrate fast enough to track their preferred habitats. Plants and animals that had coexisted for thousands of years were suddenly separated as climate zones shifted faster than natural dispersal rates could accommodate. The result was a massive reorganization of ecological communities. As species that had never previously interacted were brought together in new combinations. Large mammal populations were particularly vulnerable to these rapid habitat changes. The extinction patterns don't suggest gradual decline due to slow environmental change. Instead, they show sudden disappearances that coincide with major environmental disruption events. Mammoths, giant ground sloths, American cheetahs, and dozens of other species vanished during this period of unprecedented change. But extinction wasn't the only biological response to these catastrophic changes. The environmental disruption also created unprecedented opportunities for evolutionary innovation and ecological experimentation. Species that could adapt quickly to changing conditions expanded rapidly into new territories. New ecological niches opened up as traditional community structures collapsed and reformed. The fossil record shows evidence of rapid evolutionary changes as populations adapted to new environmental pressures. Small mammals, in particular, show signs of rapid size changes, dietary shifts, and behavioral modifications that occurred over just a few hundred generations. These changes demonstrate life's remarkable capacity for adaptation when faced with extreme environmental pressures. Human populations were both witnesses to and participants in these massive biological reorganizations. The archaeological record shows clear evidence that human groups played active roles in shaping post-flood ecosystems through their hunting practices, fire use, and early experiments with plant and animal management. The development of more intensive resource management strategies during this period wasn't just a response to environmental scarcity. It was also an adaptation to the new opportunities created by environmental disruption. The fertile soils and diverse habitats created by flooding provided ideal conditions for early experiments with cultivation and animal domestication. Many of the world's first agricultural centers developed in regions that had been directly shaped by Ice Age flooding events. The Fertile Crescent, where agriculture first emerged in the Old World, was carved and fertilized by floods from melting mountain glaciers. Similar patterns appear in China, where the Yellow and Yangtze river valleys bear clear geological signatures of catastrophic drainage events. The connection between flooding and agricultural development wasn't coincidental. The environmental disruption created by catastrophic drainage forced human populations to develop more intensive and reliable food production strategies. Traditional hunting and gathering became increasingly difficult as familiar landscapes disappeared and animal populations crashed or migrated beyond reach. But the floods also provided the raw materials needed for agricultural success. River valleys carved by rushing water collected fertile sediments eroded from vast upstream areas. Floodplains created by repeated inundation developed deep, rich soils perfect for early farming experiments. Natural irrigation systems established by flood channels provided reliable water sources for crop cultivation. The social innovations that emerged during this period were equally important for humanity's future development. The environmental challenges created by rapid change forced human groups to develop new forms of cooperation and resource sharing. Traditional territorial boundaries became meaningless as familiar landscapes disappeared overnight. Evidence suggests that trade networks expanded dramatically during this period as communities sought to maintain access to resources that were no longer locally available. New technologies for transportation and communication emerged as groups needed to coordinate responses to environmental challenges that no single community could handle alone. The artistic record from this period also shows remarkable creativity as human cultures processed the psychological impact of living through unprecedented environmental upheaval. Rock art sites often depict water-related themes and dramatic landscape features that may represent cultural memories of catastrophic flooding events. Some of the most sophisticated cave art in human history was created during this period of environmental stress. The famous paintings at Lascaux and Altamira date to the end of the Ice Age, when human populations were adapting to rapidly changing conditions. These artistic achievements may represent more than just aesthetic expression. They could be sophisticated information storage systems designed to preserve crucial environmental knowledge across generations. The genetic legacy of this period can still be detected in modern human populations. Molecular studies reveal clear signatures of population bottlenecks, followed by rapid expansion and mixing as groups were forced to abandon traditional territories and establish new communities in altered landscapes. These genetic patterns suggest that while human populations survived the catastrophic environmental changes of the late Ice Age, they did so with significantly reduced numbers and increased cultural exchange between previously isolated groups. The survivors carried forward not just their genes, but their accumulated knowledge, technologies, and cultural innovations. The technological developments that emerged during this period would prove crucial for humanity's future success. New hunting technologies, improved tool-making techniques, and more efficient resource processing methods all appeared as human groups adapted to rapidly changing environmental conditions. Perhaps most importantly, the period of environmental stress appears to have accelerated the development of symbolic thought and complex communication systems. The need to coordinate responses to unprecedented challenges and preserve crucial information about changing environments may have driven the evolution of more sophisticated language and cultural transmission mechanisms. The end of the Great Floods marked the beginning of the Holocene epoch, the geological period in which we still live today. But the transition wasn't immediate or complete. Smaller flooding events continued for thousands of years as remaining ice masses adjusted to new climate conditions and unstable glacial lakes continued to drain. The final major drainage event occurred around 8,000 years ago, when the last remnants of Lake Agassiz released their waters into the North Atlantic. This event triggered the 8.2 kiloyear cooling event, demonstrating that even after the major ice sheets had disappeared, the planet's climate system remained sensitive to sudden freshwater inputs. The landscapes created by these catastrophic floods provided the foundation for everything that would follow in human history. The stable river systems established during the flooding period became the transportation networks that supported the growth of early civilizations. The fertile valleys created by flood sediments became the agricultural heartlands that fed growing populations. The harbours and estuaries formed by post-flood sea level rise provided the natural ports where maritime trade would eventually develop. The predictable coastlines that emerged after the flooding ended gave human societies the stable boundaries they needed for long-term planning and development. Modern climate research has revealed that the mechanisms responsible for Ice Age flooding are not extinct. They operate within contemporary ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica, though currently at much smaller scales. Scientists study the geological evidence from Ice Age floods to better understand how modern ice masses might respond to continued warming. The parallels are sobering. Ice sheets today show many of the same signs of internal stress that preceded catastrophic collapses in the past. Surface melting creates meltwater that penetrates deep into ice masses, lubricating their bases and destabilizing their internal structure. Ocean warming undermines ice shelves from below, removing the buttressing that prevents rapid ice flow. While modern ice sheets are smaller than their Ice Age predecessors, they still contain enough water to raise global sea levels by dozens of feet if they were to collapse completely. The geological record shows that such collapses can occur much faster than previously thought possible, with major changes unfolding over decades rather than centuries. The story of the great floods that ended the Ice Age provides crucial perspective on humanity's relationship with environmental change. It demonstrates that stable-appearing systems can undergo rapid transformation when critical thresholds are exceeded. It reveals life's remarkable capacity for adaptation in the face of unprecedented disruption. But perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that the world we know today was literally created by catastrophic environmental change. The familiar geography we take for granted, the fertile valleys that feed us, the rivers that transport our goods, and the coastlines that define our nations, all emerged from the aftermath of the greatest environmental catastrophe in recent Earth history. The survivors of those ancient floods weren't just our biological ancestors. They were the inheritors and preservers of accumulated human knowledge and culture that had developed over tens of thousands of years. They carried forward not just the genetic heritage of our species, but the technological innovations, social structures, and cultural wisdom that would form the foundation for everything that followed. Understanding this history doesn't diminish human achievement or suggest that catastrophic change is inevitable. Instead, it provides crucial context for appreciating both the fragility and resilience of the systems that support complex life on our planet. The great floods remind us that Earth is capable of dramatic transformation, but also that life has an extraordinary capacity to not just survive, but ultimately flourish in the aftermath of even the most devastating changes. As we face our own period of rapid environmental change, the lessons embedded in this ancient catastrophe become increasingly relevant. They remind us that the boundary between stability and chaos can be crossed more quickly than we might expect, but also that human ingenuity and adaptability have proven capable of meeting even the most extreme challenges our planet can present. The geological archives continue to yield new insights into these remarkable events as research technologies improve and new sites are discovered. Each ice core analyzed, each sediment layer dated, and each flood channel mapped adds detail to our understanding of how quickly and dramatically our world can change when the right conditions align. The great floods that ended the Ice Age stand as a testament to Earth's capacity for both destruction and creation. They destroyed a world that had existed for tens of thousands of years, but in doing so, they created the foundation for the world we inhabit today. They remind us that even the most dramatic changes can ultimately become the building blocks for new forms of beauty, complexity, and life itself. The evidence becomes even more extraordinary when we examine how these catastrophic events were recorded in the most unlikely of places, deep beneath our feet, in layers of mud and rock that have been quietly preserving this story for thousands of years. What scientists discovered when they started drilling into lake beds and ocean floors fundamentally changed our understanding of how quickly our planet can transform itself. Picture teams of researchers working on floating platforms in the middle of seemingly ordinary lakes, extracting long cylinders of sediment that tell stories more dramatic than any fiction. These sediment cores are like books written by the Earth itself, with each layer representing a different chapter in our planet's history. And what they reveal about the speed of Ice Age flooding is absolutely mind-blowing. In normal conditions, lake sediments accumulate slowly and evenly, creating thin, regular layers that build up over thousands of years. It's a peaceful process, like dust settling on a shelf. But scattered throughout these cores, researchers found something completely different. Massive, chaotic layers that appeared suddenly in the geological record. These weren't gentle accumulations. They were catastrophic deposits laid down in single events. The texture of these flood layers tells an incredible story. Instead of the fine, sorted particles you'd expect from gradual deposition, scientists found a jumbled mixture of materials that should never appear together. Microscopic clay particles mixed with coarse sand grains, fragments of freshwater shells alongside chunks of bedrock, plant material that had been ripped from the ground and buried instantly, still preserving its original cellular structure after thousands of years. This chaotic mixing is the signature of catastrophic flooding. When water moves with tremendous force, it picks up everything in its path and carries it along without sorting or organizing. The resulting deposits look like nature's version of a blender had been turned on at maximum speed, creating a geological smoothie of materials from hundreds of miles upstream. But here's where it gets really fascinating. These flood deposits weren't just local phenomena. When researchers started comparing sediment cores from different lakes and ocean basins across North America, they found the same distinctive layers appearing at exactly the same time periods. Lakes separated by thousands of miles all recorded massive flood inputs during identical time windows, proving that these weren't isolated events but continent-wide catastrophes. The chemical signatures preserved in these sediments provide another layer of evidence that's almost like a fingerprint left by ancient floods. When massive volumes of glacial meltwater suddenly entered normal water bodies, they created distinctive isotopic patterns that can still be detected today. The oxygen isotope ratios in these flood layers are completely different from normal sediments, showing massive dilution events that could only be caused by sudden freshwater inputs. Scientists can even trace the source of the floodwater using these chemical signatures. Different ice sheets and glacial lakes had slightly different isotopic compositions based on their age and geographic location. By analyzing these fingerprints, researchers can determine not just that floods occurred, but exactly which ice masses contributed water to each catastrophic event. The marine sediment record tells an equally compelling story from a different perspective. When these massive floods reached the oceans, they didn't just mix quietly with seawater and disappear. They created underwater avalanches called turbidites that spread across vast areas of the seafloor, carrying the signatures of catastrophic flooding far from any coastline. Deep-sea drilling has revealed these turbidite deposits across multiple ocean basins, showing that the effects of Ice Age flooding were truly global in scope. The sediment layers contain materials that could only have been transported by continental-scale floods, rocks and minerals from deep within North America, spread across the Atlantic sea floor, carried by currents triggered by catastrophic drainage events. The timing of these marine deposits correlates perfectly with evidence from terrestrial flood channels and lake sediments, creating a coherent picture of synchronized catastrophic events that affected the entire planet simultaneously. This synchronization is crucial because it demonstrates that Ice Age flooding wasn't a series of random accidents, but a coordinated planetary response to changing climate conditions. Perhaps most remarkably, the sediment record reveals that these catastrophic events repeated multiple times over several thousand years. Rather than single massive floods, the evidence shows cycles of catastrophic drainage as ice dams reformed and failed repeatedly. Some regions experienced dozens of these events, each one carving deeper channels and depositing thicker sediment layers. Lake Missoula provides the most detailed example of this cyclical flooding. Geological evidence suggests that the ice dam holding back this massive lake failed at least 40 times over a period of several thousand years. Each failure released the entire contents of the lake in a matter of days, creating floods that reshaped the Pacific Northwest before the ice dam reformed, and the cycle began again. The regularity of these cycles appears to be connected to broader climate oscillations that were affecting ice sheet stability across the entire planet. As global temperatures fluctuated during the overall warming trend, ice sheets advanced and retreated in complex patterns that created windows of vulnerability when catastrophic drainage became inevitable. The biological evidence preserved in these sediments adds another dimension to the story that's both tragic and inspiring. Pollen grains trapped in flood deposits reveal sudden, dramatic changes in vegetation patterns that occurred within decades rather than the thousands of years typically required for major ecological transitions. Microscopic organisms preserved in lake sediments show population crashes and species replacements that coincide exactly with flood events. These weren't gradual evolutionary changes, but ecological catastrophes followed by rapid recovery and reorganization. Entire communities of aquatic life were eliminated, only to be replaced by completely different assemblages of species within a few generations. Yet the fossil record also shows remarkable resilience and innovation. Species that survived these catastrophic events often underwent rapid evolutionary changes, adapting to new environmental conditions with a speed that challenges traditional understanding of evolutionary processes. The environmental disruption created new ecological niches that were quickly filled by organisms capable of rapid adaptation. The archaeological record provides equally dramatic evidence of human responses to these environmental catastrophes. Sites that show continuous occupation for thousands of years are suddenly abandoned during periods coinciding with major flood events. When reoccupation occurs, it often involves completely different cultural groups with distinct technologies and subsistence strategies. Human populations didn't just survive these catastrophic changes, they innovated in response to them. New tool technologies emerged that were better suited to rapidly changing environments. Social organization patterns shifted to accommodate increased mobility and resource uncertainty. Trade networks expanded as groups sought to maintain access to materials that were no longer locally available. The genetic evidence preserved in modern human populations still carries signatures of these ancient environmental catastrophes. Molecular studies reveal clear bottlenecks in human genetic diversity that occurred during the late Ice Age, followed by rapid population expansion as conditions stabilized. These patterns suggest that while humanity survived the Great Floods, it did so with significantly reduced numbers and increased mixing between previously isolated groups. Some of the most sophisticated technological innovations in human history emerged during this period of environmental stress. Advanced projectile weapons, improved food processing techniques, and more efficient shelter construction all appeared as human groups adapted to unpredictable and rapidly changing conditions. The pressure of survival in a chaotic environment appears to have accelerated technological development beyond what might have occurred under stable conditions. The artistic record from this period shows equally remarkable creativity and innovation. Some of the world's most sophisticated cave art was created during the environmental upheaval of the late Ice Age. These artistic achievements may represent more than aesthetic expression. They could be sophisticated information storage systems designed to preserve crucial environmental knowledge across generations. Rock art sites from this period often feature water-related themes and dramatic landscape depictions that may represent cultural memories of catastrophic flooding events. The consistency of these themes across different cultures and continents suggests that flood stories weren't just mythology, but genuine cultural memories of real environmental catastrophes. The technological foundations for agriculture were also laid during this period of environmental disruption. As traditional hunting and gathering resources became unreliable due to rapid habitat changes, human groups began experimenting with more intensive management of plant and animal resources. The environmental pressure created by catastrophic change forced innovation in food production strategies. Many of the world's first agricultural centers developed in regions that had been directly affected by Ice Age flooding. The fertile river valleys carved by catastrophic drainage provided ideal conditions for early farming experiments. The rich soils created by flood deposits offered perfect growing conditions for wild plants that would eventually be domesticated into modern crops. The Fertile Crescent, where agriculture first emerged in the Old World, bears clear geological signatures of Ice Age flooding events. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers follow courses that were established during catastrophic drainage of mountain glacial lakes. The sediments that created the region's legendary fertility were deposited by floods that occurred as Ice Age conditions collapsed. Similar patterns appear in other early agricultural centers around the world. The Yellow River Valley in China, the Indus Valley in Pakistan, and the Central Valleys of Mexico all show evidence of having been shaped by catastrophic flooding during the transition out of the Ice Age. The connection between ancient floods and agricultural development appears to be more than coincidental. The social innovations that emerged during this period were equally important for humanity's future development. Environmental challenges that no single group could handle alone forced the development of new forms of cooperation and resource sharing. Traditional territorial boundaries became meaningless as familiar landscapes disappeared and reformed repeatedly. Evidence suggests that long-distance trade networks expanded dramatically during this period, as communities sought to maintain access to resources that were no longer locally available. New technologies for transportation and communication emerged as groups needed to coordinate responses to environmental challenges that required collective action. The period of catastrophic flooding also appears to have accelerated the development of more sophisticated symbolic thought and communication systems. The need to preserve and transmit complex environmental knowledge across generations may have driven the evolution of more advanced language capabilities and cultural transmission mechanisms. Complex ritual and ceremonial practices also emerged during this period, possibly as ways of processing the psychological trauma of living through unprecedented environmental upheaval. Archaeological sites from this era show evidence of elaborate burial practices and ceremonial activities that were far more sophisticated than anything from earlier periods. The environmental disruption created by catastrophic flooding had lasting effects that extended far beyond the immediate damage. The new landscapes created by these events provided the geographical foundation for everything that would follow in human history. River systems established during the flooding period became the transportation networks that would later support trade and communication between distant regions. The fertile valleys carved by floodwaters became the agricultural heartlands that would feed growing populations as human societies developed greater complexity. The harbours and estuaries formed by rising sea levels provided natural ports where maritime trade would eventually flourish, connecting continents through ocean-spanning networks. The stable coastlines that emerged after the major flooding ended gave human societies the predictable boundaries they needed for long-term planning and territorial development. Without these stable geographic features, the development of complex civilizations with permanent settlements and specialized economic activities would have been impossible. Modern research has revealed that the geological processes responsible for Ice Age flooding haven't disappeared. They continue to operate within contemporary ice sheets, though currently at much smaller scales. Scientists study the evidence from ancient floods to better understand how modern ice masses in Greenland and Antarctica might respond to continued warming. The parallels between past and present are both fascinating and concerning. Ice sheets today show many of the same signs of internal stress that preceded catastrophic collapses during the Ice Age. Surface melting creates water that penetrates deep into ice masses, potentially destabilizing their internal structure. Ocean warming undermines ice shelves from below, removing barriers that prevent rapid ice flow toward the sea. While modern ice sheets are much smaller than their Ice Age predecessors, they still contain enormous volumes of water. Complete collapse of the Greenland ice sheet would raise global sea levels by about 20 feet, while total Antarctic ice sheet collapse could contribute over 150 feet of sea level rise. The geological record shows that such changes can occur much faster than previously thought possible. The study of Ice Age floods has revolutionized scientific understanding of how Earth's systems respond to environmental stress. The traditional view of gradual, predictable climate change has been replaced by recognition that planetary systems can undergo rapid, dramatic transformations when critical thresholds are exceeded. This research has profound implications for understanding modern environmental challenges. It demonstrates that stable-appearing systems can collapse suddenly when pushed beyond their tolerance limits. It reveals that environmental changes can occur faster than human societies typically prepare for, requiring more flexible and adaptive approaches to long-term planning. But the story of Ice Age floods also provides hope and inspiration. It shows that life has an extraordinary capacity for adaptation and innovation in the face of even the most extreme environmental challenges. Human societies not only survived these ancient catastrophes, but used them as opportunities for technological and cultural advancement. The survivors of the Great Floods weren't just passive victims of environmental change. They were active participants in creating new ways of life adapted to transformed landscapes. Their innovations in technology, social organization, and resource management provided the foundation for all subsequent human achievements. The archaeological evidence shows that human creativity and problem-solving ability actually flourished during periods of environmental stress. The most sophisticated technologies, artistic achievements, and social innovations often emerged during the most challenging times, suggesting that environmental pressure can be a powerful driver of cultural evolution. The genetic legacy of Ice Age flooding survivors is still present in modern human populations. We carry within our DNA the heritage of people who proved that humanity could adapt to environmental changes more dramatic than anything in recorded history. Their survival demonstrates our species' remarkable resilience and adaptive capacity. Understanding this history provides crucial perspective for facing contemporary environmental challenges. While modern climate change differs in important ways from Ice Age flooding, the fundamental principles remain the same. Environmental systems can change rapidly when thresholds are crossed, but life has proven capable of adaptation even under the most extreme conditions. The Great Floods that ended the Ice Age represent one of the most dramatic examples of rapid environmental transformation in Earth's recent history. They reshaped continents, altered ocean circulation patterns, and created the geographical foundation for human civilization. They destroyed an ancient world but created the modern one in the process. The sediment layers, chemical signatures, and biological evidence preserved in rocks and lake beds continue to reveal new details about these extraordinary events. Each core drilled and each analysis completed adds to our understanding of how quickly and dramatically our planet can change when the right conditions align. These ancient catastrophes remind us that Earth is capable of both destruction and creation on scales that dwarf human experience. They demonstrate that even the most devastating changes can ultimately become the foundation for new forms of life and beauty. The floods that ended the Ice Age didn't just mark the end of one era. They created the beginning of everything that would follow, including the stable world that allowed human civilization to develop and flourish. The story continues to unfold as researchers discover new evidence and develop better techniques for reading the geological record. The Great Floods remain as a testament to our planet's dynamic nature and life's extraordinary capacity for survival, adaptation, and renewal in the face of even the most catastrophic changes imaginable. The reconstruction of these ancient catastrophes relies on evidence that extends far beyond what we've already explored. Scientists have discovered that the timing of these massive floods can be pinpointed with remarkable precision using techniques that read the Earth's own internal clock. What they've found challenges everything we thought we knew about how quickly our planet can reorganize itself. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials trapped within flood deposits has revealed that many of these catastrophic events unfolded over timeframes measured in years, not centuries. Tree branches, leaves, and other plant matter, caught up in the rushing waters, were buried so quickly that they were perfectly preserved, creating natural time capsules that scientists can date with extraordinary accuracy. The results are staggering. Some of the largest landscape modifications in North America occurred within single decades. The carving of entire river valleys, the deposition of sediment layers hundreds of feet thick, and the creation of geological features that should have taken millions of years to form, all happened faster than a human generation could witness from start to finish. This precision timing has allowed researchers to correlate flood events with other types of evidence in ways that create an incredibly detailed timeline of catastrophic change. Ice core records from Greenland show atmospheric dust spikes that coincide exactly with major flood events, indicating that the scouring of landscapes was so extensive it affected air quality across the entire northern hemisphere. Tree ring records from surviving forests show growth disruptions and chemical changes that align with flood chronologies, revealing how these events affected ecosystems hundreds of miles from the actual flood paths. Even pollen records from distant lakes show sudden changes in vegetation patterns that track precisely with the timing of catastrophic drainage events. The synchronization of evidence across such vast distances and different types of geological archives demonstrates that these weren't isolated regional disasters. They were planetary-scale events that affected multiple Earth systems simultaneously. When ice dams failed in North America, the effects rippled through atmospheric circulation patterns, ocean currents, and biological systems worldwide. Marine records provide another crucial piece of this timing puzzle. When massive floods reached the oceans, they created distinctive chemical signatures that can be detected in seafloor sediments. These signatures appear simultaneously in ocean basins separated by thousands of miles, confirming that the floods were delivering enormous volumes of fresh water to multiple ocean systems at the same time. The precision of this timing evidence has revealed something unexpected about the relationship between different flood events. Rather than occurring randomly over thousands of years, many of the largest floods clustered within remarkably short time windows. Some regions experienced multiple catastrophic drainage events within centuries of each other, suggesting that the destabilization of one ice mass often triggered the failure of others. This clustering effect makes sense when we consider the interconnected nature of Earth's climate system. When massive volumes of fresh water suddenly entered the oceans, they disrupted circulation patterns that affected ice sheet stability thousands of miles away. The failure of ice dams in one region could create atmospheric and oceanic conditions that made similar failures likely elsewhere. The biological response to these precisely timed catastrophic events was equally dramatic and well documented. Genetic studies of modern plant and animal populations reveal clear bottlenecks that occurred during specific time windows corresponding to major flood events. These genetic signatures show that many species survived these catastrophes with drastically reduced population sizes before expanding rapidly once conditions stabilized. Forest ecosystems provide particularly detailed records of how quickly biological communities responded to catastrophic change. Pollen analysis from lake sediments shows that entire forest types could disappear from vast regions within decades, replaced by completely different plant communities adapted to the new environmental conditions created by flooding. The speed of these vegetation changes was unprecedented in the ecological record. Normal forest succession occurs over centuries as different tree species gradually replace each other through natural competition and environmental change. But the post-flood vegetation changes happen so rapidly that they represent ecological reorganization rather than succession. Human populations were intimately connected to these precisely timed environmental changes. Archaeological evidence shows that major cultural transitions often occurred within decades of catastrophic flood events. The Clovis culture, which had dominated North American hunting strategies for over 1,000 years, disappeared during a period of intense environmental upheaval that included multiple flood events and rapid climate changes. The replacement of Clovis technology with completely different tool traditions happened remarkably quickly across vast areas of the continent. This suggests that environmental pressures created by flooding and associated climate changes were severe enough to disrupt cultural transmission patterns that had remained stable for millennia. But human responses to these catastrophic events weren't limited to abandonment and cultural collapse. Archaeological evidence also shows remarkable innovations that emerged specifically in response to environmental challenges created by flooding. New hunting technologies, improved food processing techniques, and more efficient shelter designs all appeared during periods of maximum environmental stress. The development of long-distance trade networks appears to have accelerated dramatically during this period, as communities sought to maintain access to resources that were no longer locally available due to environmental disruption. Exotic materials appear in archaeological sites much earlier than expected, suggesting that necessity drove the expansion of economic relationships across previously insurmountable distances. Social organization patterns also evolved rapidly in response to environmental pressures. Evidence suggests that group mobility increased significantly during periods of environmental instability, with communities developing more flexible territorial arrangements that could accommodate rapid changes in resource availability. The artistic record from this period provides fascinating insights into how human cultures process the psychological impact of living through unprecedented environmental upheaval. Rock art sites often feature themes related to water, dramatic landscape features, and supernatural beings that may represent cultural attempts to understand and control catastrophic natural forces. Some researchers suggest that certain mythological themes found in cultures worldwide may represent cultural memories of actual flood events experienced by ancestral populations. Stories of great floods, lost lands, and supernatural interventions appear with remarkable consistency across cultures that had no historical contact, suggesting possible common origins in shared environmental experiences. The technological innovations that emerged during this period of environmental stress would prove crucial for humanity's long-term success. Advanced projectile weapons, sophisticated food processing tools, and improved construction techniques all appeared as human groups adapted to rapidly changing and often dangerous environmental conditions. Perhaps most importantly, this period of environmental catastrophe appears to have accelerated the development of more complex symbolic thought and communication systems. The need to preserve and transmit crucial environmental knowledge across generations may have driven the evolution of more sophisticated language capabilities and cultural learning mechanisms. The environmental disruption created by catastrophic flooding had effects that extended far beyond the immediate physical damage. The new landscapes carved by floodwaters provided the geographical foundation for everything that would follow in human history. Many of the world's major river systems still follow courses that were established during this period of catastrophic drainage. The Mississippi River system, for example, was largely shaped by the complex drainage history of glacial Lake Agassiz and other ice-dammed lakes. Each catastrophic drainage event contributed to the development of the river network that would later become crucial for transportation, agriculture, and economic development across much of North America. Similar patterns appear on other continents, where Ice Age flooding carved new river valleys and established drainage patterns that continue to influence human settlement and economic activity today. The Amazon basin, the Ganges Valley, and major river systems across northern Europe all bear geological signatures of catastrophic drainage events that occurred during the collapse of Ice Age conditions. The fertile soils created by flood deposits became some of the most productive agricultural regions in the world. The sediments carried by catastrophic floods were rich in nutrients eroded from vast upstream areas, creating growing conditions that were ideal for the development of intensive agriculture thousands of years later. Many early agricultural centers developed in regions that had been directly affected by Ice Age flooding. The exceptional fertility of these areas wasn't coincidental. It was a direct result of the massive soil redistribution that occurred during catastrophic drainage events. The floods that destroyed existing ecosystems also created the foundation for agricultural abundance that would support growing human populations. The harbors and estuaries formed by post-flood sea level changes provided natural ports where maritime trade would eventually develop. These geographical features, created by the environmental catastrophes of the Ice Age, became crucial for connecting distant regions through ocean-based transportation networks. The stable coastlines that emerged after the major flooding episodes ended provided predictable boundaries that human societies needed for long-term territorial development. Without these stable geographical features, the development of complex civilizations with permanent settlements and specialized economic activities would have been much more difficult. Modern scientific research has revealed that the geological processes responsible for Ice Age flooding continue to operate within contemporary ice sheets. Scientists study ancient flood evidence to better understand how modern ice masses might respond to continued warming, and the parallels are both fascinating and sobering. Ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica show many of the same structural features that preceded catastrophic collapses during the Ice Age. Surface melting creates meltwater that can penetrate deep into ice masses, potentially lubricating their bases and destabilizing their internal structure. Ocean warming undermines ice shelves from below, removing barriers that prevent rapid ice movement toward the sea. The mechanisms that triggered ancient catastrophic drainage events are not extinct. They remain active within modern ice sheets, though currently operating at much smaller scales than during the Ice Age. Understanding how these processes worked in the past provides crucial insights into how they might behave under different future climate conditions. The study of Ice Age floods has fundamentally changed scientific understanding of how Earth's systems respond to environmental stress. The traditional view of gradual, predictable change has been replaced by recognition that planetary systems can undergo rapid, dramatic transformations when critical thresholds are exceeded. This research has profound implications for understanding contemporary environmental challenges. It demonstrates that seemingly stable systems can collapse suddenly when pushed beyond their tolerance limits. It reveals that environmental changes can unfold faster than human societies typically prepare for, requiring more flexible and adaptive approaches to long-term planning. The story of Ice Age flooding also provides important lessons about resilience and adaptation. Life demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for survival and innovation, even under the most extreme environmental conditions. Human societies not only survived these ancient catastrophes, but used them as opportunities for technological and cultural advancement. The innovations that emerged during this period of environmental stress provided the foundation for many subsequent human achievements. Technologies developed under pressure of survival in a chaotic environment proved valuable long after conditions stabilized. Social organization patterns that emerged in response to environmental uncertainty became templates for more complex societies. The genetic heritage of flood survivors is still present in modern human populations. We carry within our DNA the legacy of people who proved that humanity could adapt to environmental changes more dramatic than anything in recorded history. Their survival demonstrates our species' remarkable resilience and problem-solving ability. Understanding this history provides crucial perspective for contemporary environmental challenges. While modern climate change differs in important ways from Ice Age catastrophes, the fundamental principles of environmental response and adaptation remain relevant. Systems can change rapidly when thresholds are crossed, but life has proven capable of remarkable innovation under pressure. The geological record continues to yield new insights about these extraordinary events as research techniques improve and new evidence sites are discovered. Each sediment core analyzed, each flood channel mapped, and each chronological sequence refined adds detail to our understanding of how quickly and dramatically our planet can transform when conditions align. The great floods that ended the Ice Age represent one of the most clear examples of rapid environmental change in Earth's recent past. They demonstrate both the potential for catastrophic disruption and the remarkable capacity of life to not only survive, but ultimately flourish in transformed landscapes. These ancient events remind us that even the most dramatic environmental changes can become the foundation for new forms of complexity and abundance. The evidence preserved in rocks, sediments, and biological archives continues to tell this remarkable story of destruction and creation. The floods that carved our modern world remain as testimony to Earth's dynamic nature and life's extraordinary ability to adapt, survive, and thrive even under the most challenging conditions our planet can create. As research continues and new discoveries emerge, the story of these catastrophic floods becomes ever more detailed and compelling. They stand as proof that our world was literally shaped by some of the most dramatic environmental events in recent geological history, events that destroyed one world, but created the foundation for everything that would follow, including the stable conditions that allowed human civilization to develop and flourish across the transformed landscapes left in their wake. Their wake The most haunting evidence of these catastrophic floods lies not in the dramatic channels they carved, but in what they left behind. Scattered across the landscapes of North America, researchers have discovered something that defies easy explanation. Massive boulders, some weighing hundreds of tons, sitting alone in places where no boulder should exist. These aren't ordinary rocks that roll down from nearby mountains. They're granite erratics from the Canadian Shield, transported hundreds of miles from their original locations and deposited in regions of completely different geology. The physics required to move these giants tells us something extraordinary about the power of the water that carried them. To lift and transport a boulder weighing 300 tons requires water moving at velocities exceeding 40 miles per hour at depths of several hundred feet. These aren't theoretical calculations. They're engineering requirements based on the actual size and weight of rocks that can be measured and analyzed today. The floods that moved these boulders operated at energy levels that dwarf anything in the modern world. But the boulder fields tell us more than just how powerful these floods were. They reveal something about how the water behaved as it moved across the landscape. The distribution pattern of these erratics shows that the floods didn't follow simple downhill paths like normal rivers. Instead, they moved across relatively flat terrain, spreading out in massive sheets of water that could transport heavy debris across entire watersheds. In some areas, researchers have found what they call boulder trains, linear arrangements of massive rocks that mark the exact path followed by floodwaters as they carved their way across the continent. These boulder trains stretch for hundreds of miles, creating geological breadcrumbs that allow scientists to reconstruct the precise routes followed by ancient floods. The evidence becomes even more compelling when we examine the microscopic details preserved within these flood deposits. Quartz grains from the sediments show distinctive fracture patterns that form only under extreme stress conditions. These percussion marks indicate that the sediments were subjected to impacts and pressures far exceeding anything that occurs in normal river environments. Electron microscope analysis of these quartz grains reveals surface textures that can only be created by sustained, high-velocity collisions between particles suspended in turbulent water. The grains look like they've been through a rock tumbler running at maximum speed for extended periods, which is essentially what happened during these catastrophic flood events. The magnetic properties of flood sediments provide another line of evidence that's particularly fascinating. When sediments are deposited rapidly under high-energy conditions, the magnetic minerals within them align differently than materials laid down slowly in calm water. These magnetic signatures can be measured and compared to known standards, providing another way to confirm the catastrophic nature of these deposits. Paleomagnetic analysis of flood sediments shows chaotic orientations that indicate extremely rapid deposition under turbulent conditions. This magnetic disorder is the geological equivalent of a fingerprint left by catastrophic flooding, distinguishing these deposits from anything formed through normal sedimentary processes. The biological evidence preserved within flood deposits adds another dimension to our understanding of how quickly these events unfolded. Researchers have found intact leaves, twigs, and even delicate insect remains buried within flood sediments, preserved so perfectly that cellular structures are still visible under microscopic examination. This level of preservation is only possible when organic material is buried extremely rapidly, before decomposition or scavenging can occur. The presence of such delicate materials within massive flood deposits indicates that the burial happened within hours or days, not the years or decades typically required for normal sediment accumulation. Pollen analysis from these organic remains reveals sudden shifts in plant communities that coincide exactly with flood events. Pollen from cold-adapted species appears mixed with temperate varieties that shouldn't have coexisted, indicating that the floods were carrying material from diverse climate zones and depositing it all together in chaotic mixtures. The isotopic composition of organic matter in flood deposits tells another remarkable story. Carbon isotope ratios show that much of the organic material was derived from soils and vegetation that had been frozen for thousands of years before being suddenly exposed and eroded by floodwaters. This permafrost carbon had been locked away since earlier Ice Age conditions, only to be mobilized and redeposited during catastrophic drainage events. When massive volumes of this ancient organic matter were suddenly exposed to warmer conditions and decomposition, they released significant amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Ice core records show spikes in atmospheric carbon dioxide and methane concentrations that correlate precisely with the timing of major flood events, demonstrating the global atmospheric impact of these regional catastrophes. So there you have it. The great floods that ended the last ice age weren't just footnotes in Earth's history. They were the architects of our modern world. Every river valley where cities now stand, every fertile plain that feeds millions, every harbour where ships dock, all of it carved and shaped by water moving faster and more powerfully than anything we can imagine today. These catastrophic events remind us that our planet is capable of transformation on scales that dwarf human experience, yet they also demonstrate life's extraordinary resilience. Our ancestors didn't just survive these ultimate tests of adaptability. They innovated, they adapted, and they laid the groundwork for everything that followed. The next time you look at a river, remember that it might be following a course carved by ancient floods. When you see fertile farmland, consider that it might rest on sediments deposited by catastrophic waters. The stable world we know today emerged from the most dramatic environmental upheaval in recent Earth history.